Welcome back to Sociology 227. This is David Harvey, video 2. In this video I have 3 goals. First, I'm going to outline what Harvey means by accumulation by dispossession, and I'll give you some examples. Next, I want to theorize neoliberalism more generally, again, looking to work from SOCY 226. Finally, I'm going to get you ready for your tutorials. Let's do it. Key to David Harvey's formulation of neoliberalism is Marx's notion of the so-called primitive accumulation. This is the process through which things that were not themselves commodities came to be exchanged as such. I had previously used the example of colonialism to make this apparent. With the European colonial project, land and resources that did not have an exchange value in Canada were given one, through wars, expropriation, and so on. This violent process of accumulation was one where capitalism was extended to places where it did not exist before. Harvey's understanding of accumulation follows from Marx's argument. However, the extent is much greater. He's not only talking about giving particular things a value, but in new forms of valuation that emerge and overlap in capitalist life. This can take numerous forms. It can refer to commodities that are bundles of other commodities, as in something like mutual funds. Or it can refer to something like taking an asset that is owned by the public sphere and bringing it over to the private sector. Think about something like the sale of a public corporation or a public-private partnership. Here we find new forms of valuation and opportunities for profit extracted from an existing entity. Another great example, and this occurs throughout the United States, would be a private prison. Accumulation by dispossession ultimately means doubling the same process that Marx was writing about in Capital. This should make the historical argument clear. Though so-called primitive accumulation continues, accumulation by dispossession is a secondary step in the same process. Harvey is simply illustrating a derivative process of something highlighted by Marx all those years ago. More accumulation. Accumulation by dispossession takes 4 major forms. Let's go through them. The first form of accumulation by dispossession is privatization. That would be the act of taking a publicly owned or state-run entity and selling it. This is precisely what happened in terms of the sale of Hydro Ontario, as pictured in this beautiful diagram I stole from their website. Privatization, as the sale of state assets, is quite important in sociological theorizations of neoliberalism. Equally important, however, are the justifications for why. In many cases, the argument is that government can't do the dirty work that the private sector can, given that public employees are generally paid more, unionized, etc. The private sector is leaner, meaner, and can deliver the job at a much lower cost than the public can. It is in our welfare, therefore, to get rid of our stuff. Here I would note that privatization refers to both the sale of public assets as well as the general tendency to look to the private sector for solutions to hitherto public problems. This could mean subtracting out medical services to a third party, as we often do in Canada. Go to the hospital and look at who's working there. You'll see cleaning crews, security guards, many of them working in the healthcare sector, but off the public purse. The next form is financialization. Financialization refers to new kinds of commodities hitting the financial markets, but also to the ways in which finance has permeated all aspects of our lives. Finance has, of course, existed for a long time. People have been lending other people money and charging them a bit of money for it forever, whether or not it was legal. Regardless, it's an old job. As the quote from the article indicates, however, the total market share of the industry has exploded. You don't need me to tell you this. But what I think is important is the extent to which we are all buying into these financial instruments. In Marx's age, finance would likely be restricted to capitalist financiers in the bourgeoisie, and to governments of the empires he was observing. Now, however, financial services are ubiquitous in the lives of regular folk. Not only am I referring to consumer credit, this has exploded too, but also to the extent that many people have tax-free savings accounts, mutual funds, pensions, etc. These types of schemes are only possible based on the type of primitive accumulation that Marx was talking about, but are also a far cry from the type of finance capital in the 19th century. Next, the management and manipulation of crises. Come to think of it, applying this to COVID-19 would probably be a pretty good paper topic. That there is a picture of Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister and economist, and according to the Eurogroup, not such a great negotiator. The third aspect highlighted by Harvey brings us close to the creative destruction that Schumpeter talked about in the last video. While Schumpeter was talking about the mechanisms through which innovation keeps capitalism going, Harvey is discussing the various ways that powerful classes are able to consolidate their class positions in times of upheaval. Like right now. In the piece, written 2007, Harvey is emphasizing the ways in which global financial crises are places where powerful people can gain quite a bit of money on the misfortune of others. He is particularly emphatic that groups like the World Bank and the IMF impose conditions that are friendly to rescuing investors and not to those who are experiencing financial crises through structural adjustment policies. We'll address this in greater detail during Post-Colonialism Week. What I want to highlight are domestic ways this happens as well. Say, what happened a year after Harvey wrote the piece? It was the global financial crisis of 2008. And what happened after that? Yes, while a great many people lost their houses, there were minor fines given to large banking institutions, and, well, capitalism continued unfettered. What Harvey is indicating is that the gains from financial crises are distributed exactly as Marx predicted. I just thought of how old you were in 2008. Finally, state redistributions. We can all think of one kind of redistribution that Harvey's talking about: tax cuts. This is the basis of neoliberalism, at least that is defined by Harvey here, extending market access for all. Taxes are seen as a bulwark to this, diverting money to wasteful governments rather than to the justice of the market. But aside from tax cuts, what I want to emphasize is how there are other mechanisms through which government policy benefits the upper classes in ways that are less explicit. Here I've placed a picture of Julian Fantino, who 2 jobs ago was the OPP commissioner, 1 job ago a conservative MP and cabinet minister, and then sat on the board for a cannabis company that made a great deal of money during the current legalization regime. Here, government redistribution made Fantino a lot of money. Regardless, tax cuts or marijuana legislation or private prisons or whatever, the particular industry or issue is less important than the main principle. Harvey says that Marx gives us the tools, not the technique, but the tools to analyze the contemporary changes in capitalism. We can call this advanced liberalism, late capitalism, or neoliberalism, or whatever we want. But at the end of the day, Marx was right. Neoliberalism isn't just about markets. It also has an impact on government, how we govern businesses, and how we govern ourselves in that landscape. Let's think about the airline industry. Consider the example of Ryanair. It costs you £10 to pick your seat beforehand, £10 to pay by credit card, and so on. But the flights are really cheap. We can see a general trend of flight carriers with plenty of competition to move to super low fares but also charge for extras. With these forms of competition, we also see generally depressed wages for workers in the industry. This, in kind, causes other competitors to look for ways to reduce costs. So, for other companies like Air Canada, the market dictates particular business moves. This is a form of government. When we are talking about neoliberalism, we then have to consider the ways that market competition, as a governmental goal, changes the ways that various markets operate, and the way that we, as consumers, operate within them. Consider the ways in which each of us participates in this same sort of decision-making. If you can fly for $18 versus $80, you're likely going to do so, once you consider the extras you're going to buy or avoid. Neoliberalism shapes the business landscape, but we also make decisions within it. Here we have an aspect that Harvey doesn't talk about in the piece: self-government. I want to emphasize the 2 ways in which neoliberalism shapes economic practices. It shapes both the ways in which markets are organized and the ways that people orient their personal practices within. In the article, you see a lot more of one than the other, but a complete sociology of neoliberalism should emphasize these 2 poles. On the one hand, then, we have changing market dynamics whereby airlines must be more competitive. On the other hand, neoliberalism is a condition whereby that competition shapes the choices that we make in market spaces. Here the sociological story is about following people around and seeing how new economic circumstances alter existing social structures. Have you guys heard about the website Amazon.com? It's another good example. These guys, as you might know, make a buttload of money. What I want to do is show you how, just like in the case of airline restructuring, Amazon is the neoliberal company par excellence. First of all, what's it like to work at Amazon? What types of jobs are people fulfilling for the company or other companies that provide services for Amazon? Let's think this through. Whereas traditional post-war workplaces tended to have employees working full-time at a fixed location, Amazon's workers tend to be employed on an on-demand basis. Also, there is the role of automation. What makes Amazon's stuff so much more affordable than others is the way that the company uses technology alongside the flexible workers. If anyone or anything can be replaced by a machine for less than they are paid, they are. Humans are assigned tasks that computers can't do for less. This is the basis of the business model. Finally, are Amazon's labor practices. Whereas in the industrial economic age, workers tended to be located in a single space and unionized, Amazon's workers are globally distributed and are not unionized at all. So, we can say that Amazon's new working conditions are casual, not full-time, automated whenever possible, and dispersed in terms of labor organization and global location. We can also think about Amazon and new commodity relations. Let's think about the ways that Amazon organizes the marketplace, the distribution of goods, and the way you pay for items or services that you decide to buy. Think also about the kinds of infrastructure Amazon maintains. So, obviously, most companies after the Second World War were not e-commerce platforms because the technology didn't exist. So mailing people the stuff they buy within a day is one of the mechanisms Amazon uses to distribute stuff. But this isn't all the company offers. In fact, Amazon loses money in most of the items they ship when they're shipped for free. Amazon doesn't just deliver stuff, but they're also in the data business. All the work you do when shopping is very carefully tracked, both for advertisements and to sell to other companies. Amazon is also in the hosting business, using its servers to store other companies' stuff. You'd be surprised how many places have their data stored on Amazon's servers. And Amazon has a notorious workplace platform, Amazon Mechanical Turk, or MTurk, where people bid on jobs to be performed in a task-by-task fashion, like sorting images, entering data, and so on. In these ways, Amazon makes information and information storage a commodity, and hires people in piece-by-piece fashion for this model. Finally, think about Amazon and market relations. I can't overemphasize the role that finance plays in Amazon's business practices. Here you can see the stock valuation from the firm. Amazon, like many giant tech companies, is a publicly traded entity designed solely to drive up stock prices and create shareholder value. While lots of companies have been public in the past, and will be in the future, Amazon's model is growth first, meaning that they are willing to take a loss on services in the aims of creating higher and higher shareholder values. This is financialization at its best, or worst, depending on who you ask. I want to end this lecture talking some more about how we shape ourselves in the neoliberal economy. Let's talk about interpersonal relations and interaction. I don't need to tell you about the ways in which the sharing economy has significantly changed market organization in this country and across the world. Here we can tell a pretty clear-cut story of creative destruction. That is, new forms of innovation disrupting the economic status quo. Consider how we incorporate parts of the neoliberal sharing economy into our everyday lives, and how our attachments to people and things change. Here I think the case of Airbnb is particularly interesting, as the social relations that surround it are totally distinct from those of staying in hotels. Obviously, the Airbnb market has altered real estate, with landlords opting for short-term rentals at the expense of longer-term ones, at least before COVID. But we also see a change in moral attachments in terms of clients and service providers. One can stay in an Airbnb without making any personal contact with the host and appealing to the company rather than the operator in cases where things go wrong. Those businesses providing customer service also need to change their business practices to the new responsiveness expected of them by service users. Here, neoliberalism isn't solely something imposed on mom-and-pop shops by shadowy board members, as much as it is a technologically mediated market space, shaping social relations. This is a more than just Karl Marx story. Yeah, there's a Karl Marx story at work here, where labor is alienated and social relations are shaped into the commodity form. Now, we can debate whether or not that is a good or bad thing, but the commodity form it is. But there is more to this story than only a top-down one of imposing market spaces where they didn't exist before. We also have a Max Weber story about instrumental rationalities and subjects making economic decisions based on their institutional circumstances. We have a Michel Foucault story of economics shaping institutions and industries, and individuals shaping themselves in those spaces. Think about Yelp reviewers or rating Ubers, etc. These are all technologies where we make ourselves into neoliberal citizens. And ultimately, I think there is a Durkheim story about how moral attachments are shaped in new forms of the division of labor. They can be for good or for ill, but the neoliberal space isn't solely one imposed on people, but is an active agent of socialization, as is the case with any other kind of social fact. So, once again, all roads lead back to Durkheim. He's the best. Okay, first tutorial this week. What are you going to do? You're going to do 3 things in your tutorial this week. First, you're going to meet your TAs. Next, you're going to give MS Teams a test run. Finally, you're going to review the syllabus. I know, I told you to read it, but did you? See you next week.